Hello all, and so this is going to be a somewhat different video than I do on most thinkers, as I try to present them in a more educational way, or at least to some extent tame my own interpretation over simply offering a sort of accessible way of explaining concepts. Now I want to actually use Deleuze's philosophical concepts and also look at some of the lines of flight that have not just influenced the 21st century, but themes really within culture and the way we live our world today. And so I think the best way, though, to really start this and to drive home some of my interpretations and how many of some of the influences on this channel even actually sort of converged around Deleuze's philosophy and came out in unexpected ways towards something like Christianity, as we'll get into. And so I think the best way to really go about this and try to show such a pipeline really is to ask ultimately what is transcendental empiricism, or at least these methodologies or concepts really that Deleuze builds, and how what is ultimately becomings and going more towards the outside actually for, and how this can actually create solutions, or at least enhance our epistemology or refine it, which is to say, really are we ultimately still trying to go along this journey as actual human beings, or are we actually somewhere outside of this now, and in a sort of process in and of itself, really, the novelties, the singularities, even the function, if you will, of deterritorialization and reterritorialization. Is this ultimately the defining human aspect, if you will, and what should actually be privileged and put forth, or is this ultimately a faux pas in a sort of way, as we see with many of these flight paths, if you will, or hermeneutics to come out of Deleuze's philosophy, features a sort of antagonism towards the human experience, and the limitations even of thinking, and the push towards ideological conviction and dogmatism. And so, of course, you can see that reading through of a sort of disdain, really, of the human subject. Of course, they pick apart the human subject to some degree, although I argue that many of those interpretations could perhaps get a second look, as I'll try to demonstrate here. And so, one of the more beautiful notions within A Thousand Plateaus is, of course, in the Becoming Animals, where you see these demonstrations of aesthetics that are beyond just the a priori of our experience. And so there's aesthetics within the world that I think Deleuze is really trying to get at, is really the crux of his philosophy, is to show that to us, that there is a world speaking out there. There are these virtual ideas, if you will, that come into or become quite literally, and we can observe that and we can incorporate that. But again, this is asking the question of, is that meant to be brought back to the arborescent, if you will, or is this instrumental really towards the breaking down and ultimately the transcendence of the human experience in and of itself. And I think that's a really interesting question to ask people who come out of Deleuze's readings, if you will, is ultimately, what is the becoming for? Is it to enrich and expand, our human experience, or is it meant for a different sort of project that's meant to overcome such notions? But I also want to perhaps look at, as many will do, to the technological ramifications. It's very interesting to see how when A Thousand Plateaus in particular was circulating and starting to gain an influence in the States even, that the internet was soon to come about, which of course becomes a famous metaphor really for the rhizome, although there is some contention there that I could save for another day maybe. But Marshall McLuhan, in media studies, he has this idea of the technology is really almost being a super organ, if you will, in our sight and with its relationship to vision and pictorial images, of course with our ears and something like the headphones. These are ultimately extensions, and I think there's really interesting to synthesize his idea of technological extension to our social assemblages and our technological singularities, and how they are shaped really in a sort of virtual way, if you will, towards the organs. And so this is perhaps an interesting way to see how sense, or the Deleuzian sense, if you will. And so as I tried to show in many of my older videos with how the virtual killed reason, these light speed technologies have actually pushed us away from inference and propositions and these sort of institutions that Deleuze and Guattari pull apart really in their works, and how ultimately they actually end up being incorporated into the very system that they were trying to overthrow, quite literally. And so it's perhaps interesting to see the lineage here of really perhaps missing just by a couple decades how technology is actually going to really become more dominant in the strata, and is going to actually really speed up these processes, and so like accelerationism and those sort of notions are tied toward capitalism and globalism and these technological paradigms really, and these creations of really these sense effects that we access in a central way, but with a sort of decentralized structure. And so one could perhaps argue that in using these decentralized technologies, you are actually creating a sort of greater techno-bureaucratic centrality that is actually more in this sort of sense dimension that Deleuze and Deleuze in particular talked about in his structures of logic. And so that, I think, in a really unique way actually undermines the very Enlightenment, perhaps more than what the philosopher could have done. But moving again towards the question of what does it mean to actually try to take these concepts and put them, back into the human experience, or try to incorporate them, critiques the very dogmatic, image of thought. But of course, which is true of really most of postmodernity in the 20th century and their philosophy, they ultimately are doing the same things in their critiques, even though, I think there is some value, of course, to, being aware of these limitations. Nonetheless, with their analysis, really, of the arborescent forms, or perhaps their, the sort of more implicit way of how they want us really to look between, the lines of these molar aggregates, if you will, as they would talk about. But, I'm trying to offer a different way as compared to his usual analysis of, breaking these apart, or trying to, put them together in this sort of posterior of like after this, chaotic, event, rupture, if you will, that then we have to start working on a new structure. And I'm saying, or trying to say, that no, actually, one is actually put or thrown in that Heideggerian sense into, a position where, they ultimately have to obey within, but also, need to be trained to be able to not just actualize singularities or becomings, but to actually give value judgments onto them, which can only be done within the traditions that I'm going to actually argue a bit later. But I think the metaphor for the arborescent and the tree is a good one, because the tree actually, you'll never see Deleuze, argue to, become more tree-like. He offers up, becoming more pack-like, becoming more animal-like. But of course, the tree and its relationship to, theology, the symbolism, the tree is us. The tree is, much more human-like, despite, not really having the same qualities of motion and the same sort of structures that you would have with an animal and their organs, but nonetheless the tree is a more symbolic example. And certainly within Christianity, the trees communicate. The trees, as we've seen, actually on the ecological front, they have these sort of rhizomatic systems and complexities that actually communicate in ways. And ultimately, the arborescent tree, in its ecology, actually acts as a sort of world becoming, I think, within, Deleuze's philosophy, staying true to it with, trying to see what the world's really saying as opposed to just what we have to say about it. I think the tree actually offers up this sort of reminiscent hierarchical structure, and I think in many ways Deleuze sees that, and that's why he wants us to ultimately go the other direction, because the tree has such a strong architecture. It's upright. But I think that's actually, the point of the philosophical tree, is it's a very, dangerous position to put yourself in, despite offering, beauty and aesthetics. And I think that also, ties into, what is the human experience, especially with regards to aesthetics. The aesthetic arrest is, with the German idealists certainly come to mind here. Christ is even described as a small tree. And so, in a similar way, one could see how, the tree obviously, in its reproduction, spreads these seedlings out in a similar way to how, the father instructs his, children in his house to ultimately, cultivate themselves, and, one must obey, but they also have to eventually, go off away from the father, which is of course similar to the tree. The tree, plants these seeds that are, relatively close based off of, the intensities of the wind, if you like, or whatever the milieus that make up their environment. And but nonetheless, of course, in the similar way to, the flows of the water that Deleuze is so fond of, and how, the flow is always different, even though it's, referenced constantly. I still think, though, that the tree, despite, being a singular, is ultimately much more multiplicitous, I would say. And this isn't just a metaphor really for Bongo likes trees, and he's against the rhizomatic. I think that there's a much more dense and enriching relationship for the arborescent structure to actually incorporate the rhizomatic into its thinking. And so, in the same way, really, though, that as we've seen with the 20th century now with, metaphysics, at the end of the day, though, we do have to consider that, in our examination, or Deleuze's examination of the outside, becoming as minoritarian in a homogeneous set, ultimately, though, this is still, us from the inside, just as, he was standing within a heterogeneous society himself. There is a sort of hint, really, of the old, noble savage myth here, where, you find this sort of noble qualities between a becoming's minoritarian and a new way of life, but you're still examining it from, your own lens. And of course, Deleuze is trying to get away from that. And in some respects, I think, it's admirable how he does. But does 20th century postmodern metaphysics, really do that, in the same sense that how, in the analytical tradition at the same time, Wittgenstein's, doing investigations on, how, language is a sort of game, and yet in announcing such, he's, using the linguistic game, and you can't really stand outside of such a concept. In the same way, Derrida, in his, unpacking of all of modern norms, quite literally, and metaphysical systems, he points to how, the traditions, though, ultimately contained within it the, very tracings that ultimately would, promote these singularities, within the structure itself, and his, critique and analysis of the traditions. But, I come at it from a different angle of, saying that one must understand those traditions to actually, deal with the perpetual imminence of how it's going to change. Tradition is always in change, and I think to try to look at our past and simply assert, really, that that because we have this critical analysis of, so to really understand the multiplicitous, really, attitude of something like justice, which is, of course, as the famous dialogues go with Socrates, justice has, or at least these higher ideals, these great virtues, are, put into these particulars. They're put into these singularities, these ruptures that, the tradition ultimately has to reconfigure and change and adapt to. And so to simply, say that, a tradition wasn't able to account for, a matter or something, I think this is flawed. I think this is just simply us, putting our own critical analysis onto the rest of history. And, I don't think you can actually really escape such a matter as well. And so, one of the things I think in reading Deleuze here is to really see him as more of a challenge. And I think this is one of the things that, people who have, came out of this pipeline that I've been trying to, show here. Once again, you can see these sort of concepts re-emerging and how we could actually, refine such a thing and not necessarily desert tradition or some of our logos methodologies prior, or at least not fall to the temptation really of such nihilistic notions where you're sort of post-structuralist, if you will. But there's nothing really I've noticed where one can actually apply this to their day-to-day lives, and I think that that's a very interesting way of looking at secular ideologies and really political thought as compared to why something like Christianity as a religion, and how in the incarnation, which I think is very instrumental here to look at with Deleuze's idea of events and ruptures. I want to perhaps discuss, of course, is within the logic of sense, we get the concept of the ion, and really how chaos and complexity and self-organization happens by chance in this sort of game, where probability and chance is played on these separate dice throw tables, which of course is to say in a similar way that there's these theological principles, these creation principles that you find at the end of the materialist cosmology that Deleuze actually puts forth. And so how the virtual will actually come and affect the material world, despite the fact that it is organized by this random chance in this game, and how the intensities or pretensities will actually formulate itself or organize. I think that perhaps we could also say, though, that we should understand this then, that in our aggregates, in our sort of understandings, and in our patterns, then that is actually within chaos, which of course is an interesting way to deviate towards how there's no pure chaos, of course, because then it would just simply be nothing, quite literally, because there has to be some abstract machine somewhere, and of course you find that every time in Deleuze's philosophy, wherever you find this sort of chaotic energy, this sort of vitalism that I talk about a lot, you find the abstract machine, the coding of flows by the state, the hierarchies that are I think important to perhaps examine a sort of eternalized version of this, where there are hierarchies, there's obedience, there's imperatives to be put into in a sort of way in which problems come at you. And so of course, since everyone has problems to some degree, there's a sort of universality, despite problems always having a sort of particularness. And so, instead of just perhaps, giving up on just, particulars and trying to actually form aggregates, we can actually, make more compelling ones in different and unique ways. That I think is a challenge that Deleuze actually offers up. That many of these sort of anarchists would not be interested in. Now, of course, when I brought up the ion, I also wanted to compare that to how you could perhaps see that Deleuze in a unique way is actually stumbling onto the Christian Genesis properties of creating flood and catastrophic singularities to then bring about a new world or a new order. As such, with novelties really within Deleuze's philosophy of these ruptures or intensities, but we are mysteriously, I would argue, and as seen, I think, within the incarnation, in my interpretation at least, that he's brought that the fall, of course, brings us into particulars and qualities in the consciousness, of course, that can only be described in a third person way, whether it's the written word, whether it's this video. Ultimately, though, you can't really share the same conscious particularness that, and so I think uniquely, in the incarnation or the fall, you could see this perhaps in how Deleuze looks at the sciences and the royal sciences, and of course how Bergson, in his critique of abstraction, which is of course is really about the limitation of abstraction in these qualitative differences and divisibilities within something like time. Now, of course, if you divide a distance over and over again, you could theoretically just keep going on forever. But of course, since there's intensities of motion that averts the royal sciences of representation, then there can't really ever be, or at least not yet, a sort of one law, one truth principle, if you will, that could actually measure, because of course measurements in and of itself is a presupposition into certain categories, and it doesn't actually take into account, of course, in the exterior what the becomings are to be as they are in the sort of interior or the virtual. And one could ask themselves again to try to bridge this again to the pipeline theme here, that such a world in its creation, something like the Genesis, God, in the comparison to the ion. Of course, in Christianity, this wasn't sufficient, but nonetheless, though, if we were to take this, these postmodern ideas, the Christ event was always calculated and always was ready to happen, but it ultimately happened in a particular time, in a particular place, in a particular flesh. And such a world, of course, I think one could wonder then, or such a religion for that matter, should be examined with how you could actually see that Christianity is more affirming of the sort of monism and plurality, or equals plurality, as Deleuze is famous for saying, in the incarnate event and its symbolism. So, which is to say, such a world that accounted for Christ and made way for Christ had to be a world of process, has to be a world of of molecular biology, of fields of intensity, because the act of freedom and union towards the faith. This must be a world of changes, of becomings ultimately, and so how the Father becomes into the flesh is, of course, one of the great event singularities in cultural history, if not the greatest. And so, in the similar way of how they see something like our becomings going to imperceptibility, or this sort of desire for it, this could also perhaps stand in for the desire to be, Christ-like, to live the true life of Christ, which of course Jesus is famous for not being a man of abstraction. He's a man of miracles and events. He speaks in tongues quite literally sometimes, and so such a leader, such an authority, really could perhaps again re-arise here in Deleuze's philosophy in a really unique way, I think. And now, of course, switching topics, perhaps, I'm going to go into my usual, what would Oswald Spengler think portion of this video, which, of course, I think there is a salient point. I won't go on too long because I don't think there is really a lot to compare here, other than actually their methodologies and really different ways of seeing it. But I do think that there is an important, perhaps, way at which, how Deleuze, of course, sees philosophers as one really of noticing, problems, despite the fact that we don't actually have solutions to those problems, but ultimately, we seek them, we find them, we experiment with them and find limitations within those experiences. And so, however, such a worldview and such a way of seeing, philosophy then is to perhaps, quite literally miss, what is someone's horizon that is actually intact at their historical particular time, and how that will actually be, undone, obviously through what you would say is really intensive ways that ruptured against our molecular not molecular, but our flight paths and established royal sciences, if you will. And so you're talking about a time of a golden era, really, of novelty, of all these post World War II changes in technology and ways of life. But perhaps, as Spengler points out, when philosophers start to speak up about problems, you're usually a couple steps already behind in this sort of deterministic process here. And so it's interesting to perhaps see how Deleuze is trying to find novelty, trying to find the way the world speaks, and how becoming minoritarians against global capitalism. There is a sort of interpretation that this is ultimately the changing of how novelties are actually going to become less valuable, sort of devolving, as Spengler would say, you're going into the late stage. And so Spengler actually would say that when you have this sort of yearning for novelty and this sort of city intellect of trying to find novel things for the sake of it, there's nothing to bring back to the traditions, which I think is something amiss here, to actually incorporate that into your arborescent models. this is, perhaps a critique here of looking at how, there's this sort of novelty for novelty's sake, this sort of perpetual revolution, which, as Zizek would point out, is in and of itself almost a decentralized authority that's actually perhaps even more nefarious, because the paranoid regimes that Deleuze talks about even could be arranged in such a way that one perhaps would give up formalizing power, despite the fact that they do have a sort of covert way of expressing it. Sure, you might not have wars where you ride out on horseback and everyone acknowledges that this is our historical big man. But what if you were able to actually obscure yourself in such a way that you still ultimately are powerful, an elite quite literally, but it's in a more obscure way to actually long term actually conceal their power in a more nefarious way. And so by decentralizing, as I think is a theme really actually within how Deleuze looks at power dynamics and how they're integrated again, there's the nomadic decentralization, which the state apparatus then restructures, and this sort of centrality. The similar could be said of faciality, and how that actually plays to a coherent society. There's a sort of centralization toward a friendliness towards distinct groups of people. And of course, I think in contemporary Deleuzian philosophy, there's a sort of reading that says we have to overcome faciality, because we need to overthrow these sort of arbitrary hierarchies. But ultimately, that same faciality came to that very realization is one of the driving points I would point at. And so Deleuze, I think, in a lot of ways wants to have his cake and eat it too, if you will, where his examination of becoming's minoritarian, and it's sort of saying that in a subtle way that this is the way to go about things, or the way to be revolutionary. Ultimately, though, this even the minoritarian who's supposed to be on the outside, as Deleuze would actually say within his own philosophy, in how he goes about dialectical thinking, the minoritarian is still within the inside to some extent, and this is why he feigns away from claiming positions of power within a structure. I tend to have a more optimistic look that it's an ongoing thing, and so one must actually act to some degree in accordance to these centralized faces, these friendly nominations, if you will, so that a way they can actually understand the terrain better, to become better nomads. To quite literally say, we have to actually understand really the structure well enough to actually be creative in our value judgments, and how our value judgments in and of itself cannot actually be absolved away, at least to me, and how Deleuze really and many of these anarchists, of course, are in and of itself, despite their assertions of trying to overthrow such authority, is actually within a tradition of overthrowing authority, which is kind of an interesting way of looking at it. In other words, in order to patronize and give such a value judgment on a minoritarian way of life, requires it to be in the political exterior in such a way that you can't really necessarily say that perpetual revolution then is what said minoritarian would actually be seeking to do. And it's interesting because this is one of the things they would say about such categories for what do women want, what do other people desire. Of course, he's trying to point out the multiplicitous nature of that, but I think in his seeking of it, he's actually finding other, albeit smaller, less dominant aggregates in and of themselves.